I wanted to avoid all the discussion on YouTube about whether or not prostitution should be criminalized. I wanted to avoid it for two reasons. First, although in the final analysis I side with those who think that prostitution should be decriminalized, there is much about prostitution that I don't like, so I am somewhat conflicted on the topic. Second, I think that the best way to address prostitution as a phenomenon is to address the economic conditions in society that make prostitution an economic necessity for some. As such, I believe that a much larger discussion needs to occur about the distribution of wealth in society, a discussion the successful resolution of which would not so much resolve the issue of prostitution as dissolve it as an issue of urgent and exigent import. But more about that later. The reason I am making this video is because Luddite Romantic encouraged me to do so. Luddite Romantic has proffered many excellent arguments for the criminalization of prostitution, although in the final analysis I differ with him on the issue. Let me stipulate at the onset that there is a great deal about the practice of prostitution that is and can be odious, depersonalizing, dangerous, and exploitive. It's not altogether obvious, however, how much of the intensity and facticity of these negative aspects stem precisely from the criminalization and concomitant stigmatization of prostitution. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that some residue of odiousness, depersonalization, danger, and exploitation would still obtain, even if prostitution has been decriminalized and largely destigmatized. It seems to me that prostitution would then simply join the ranks of a variety of perfectly legal professions where these negative aspects obtain. For example, the routinized tasks of working on an assembly line can be odious, highly depersonalizing, dangerous, and exploitive. It seems to me that those who argue that prostitution should be criminalized need to show that the practice of prostitution in a decriminalized and largely destigmatized state of affairs would be uniquely odious, depersonalizing, dangerous, and exploitive, in ways that all other legal and destigmatized professions are not. While that strikes me as a fair test, it also strikes me as a test that would be difficult to meet for those who want to criminalize prostitution. Furthermore, I take it as axiomatic that civil rights obtain to persons, and that part of the understanding of personhood in the civil arena is an individual's body. In short, if civil rights obtain to persons, then they also obtain, or should obtain, to their bodies. In civil affairs, the Cartesian exclusion of the body as a part of the understanding of the self or personhood would be both nonsensical and potentially repressive. I see no way of denying the obvious fact that the criminalization of prostitution is a way that society denies persons a fundamental civil right, ownership of their own bodies. Now, I am perfectly aware of the examples which purport to show that society has arrogated unto itself the power to abridge the right of ownership over one's own body. Laws against attempting suicide are an example. But I am struck by other counterexamples, like when nations tell women that they cannot have abortions, or nations that criminalize homosexuality or sex outside of marriage. Except for cases that involve death or a clear risk of substantial physical injury or harm to others, I think that we should err on the side of letting people do as they wish with their bodies. Finally, I do not think that the vast majority of prostitutes engage in prostitution because they love the profession per se. I suspect that economic necessity drives them into prostitution. That goes to how wealth is divided in a society. I support an equitable distribution of wealth. In short, I support an economic state of affairs that would effectively dissolve the economic necessity for prostitution. Of course, what constitutes an equitable distribution of wealth is another and much larger topic for discussion, one that I cannot involve myself in this video. Nevertheless, I think that the fundamental issue with prostitution is economic, and it is simply wrong-headed to treat it as primarily an issue about permissibility. Thanks. Appreciate your attention.